Welcome back to Mythvision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. There is something very special about today's episode, a unique course with Dr. Bart D. Ehrman and Dr. Javad T. Hashmi. We have a New Testament scholar who's doing a historical critical approach on the Gospels. Do I need to introduce him? As you know, everybody has seen Bart Ehrman. But there's another scholar I want to highlight coming from the Quran and historical critical method applied to Islam, its early sources. How do we understand that? And a lot of people don't realize that the practices we find in the New Testament and how we apply these things to the Bible are also being practiced on the Holy Quran. So, with that being said, welcome to Mythvision. How are you, Dr. Javad and Bart?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on with you and, of course, with the esteemed Sheikh Bart Ehrman. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you both. Yeah, it's good to be with the two of you.
I really appreciate you both taking the time to join me today and discuss about this project. This never been done in the public eye, it seems. And before we do, I want to just say up front, humans have crafted stories to give meaning and value to origin of identity, their group, lessons. We do it today in fictional movies and things like that. And one of the things I seriously value about you, Javad, is that you're recognizing what I think is obvious to most, but because this is such a sacred area and there's been a long-standing tradition on how we should evaluate the Quran, you're just coming out saying, I find legend and story in the Quran, but how you interpret that is unique. And so I have to highlight that with you because Bart Ehrman, as everyone knows, has long told there are legends, there are stories, there's some fiction we find in the Gospels, in the New Testament. Just take any of his courses and you find out. So I figure let's jump right in the deep end and talk about legends, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, go for it. So what's the exact question, though?
Are there legends in the Quran?
Well, that's what the course is about. So, but you're now going straight to the conclusion. That's what the course is going to explore. So yes, that is my own conclusion. And that's from a decade of study that I've had to swallow a lot of bullets, I would say. That's the experience that I've had from, studying the historical critical approach. But in this course, I hope to overview all of the different viewpoints on this issue, including the kind of Islamic traditionalist idea that I grew up with. And then what are the problems with that and how do people reconcile that? And then eventually I'll say, okay, this is what I landed upon, but I don't want to make the course just what I think. It's about the different viewpoints.
Turning the question to you, Bart, and you could do yes or no. Does the New Testament have legends about Jesus?
I thought you were going to ask me if the Quran does. I mean, you turned it on me. Right. Part of the issue is how you define legend, how you differentiate that from myth, for example, or fable or story or fiction. So I usually define a legend as a fictional account about a historical figure. And so, I think there are legends about George Washington, for example. And I think that there are definitely legends about Jesus in the New Testament, by which I mean that there are narrations of things that he did, for example, that I don't think historically happened, but storytellers are telling these episodes for particular reasons, often for religious reasons. And so you don't get that with George Washington per se. You don't get legends about him to support religion, but you do get legends about George Washington because of who he was, the founder of the father of our country. And so legends about him tend to support an understanding of America in a certain way. Legends about Jesus tend to support understandings of the significance of Jesus religiously in certain ways. And so I would say that they do function similarly. And I definitely do think that there's that kind of thing in the New Testament.
I want to go to your course that both you gentlemen are participating in for 1 second and highlight what I think is an interesting angle. And that is the Bible and the Quran comparing their historical problems. Now, we can't give away the course because that would take 8 lectures to do, and you got to sign up to do it. Tell us, what was your intention? What did both you gentlemen have in mind when you said, let's approach this from both sacred pieces of literature, and we need to educate the world on this? What is it that you had in mind?
So if I could take the first stab at that, I approached Bart on this because, and that's why I called him Sheikh Bart Ehrman, is because I noticed that a lot of my fellow Muslims love Bart Ehrman's course, and I'm one of them, of course. I mean, his material, but I don't think many of them think about, if we take this same historical approach and apply it to our own sources, our own scripture, well, what is that going to look like? And so that's kind of the impetus behind me asking Bart, hey, let's teach this course, because I think some of those conclusions, like I said, they're going to be some tough bullets for Muslims to swallow. Now, I don't think that that'll be the end of faith or anything like that, but I think it is some soul searching and existential crises that will take place if you do that.
Yeah. So on my part, Javad came up to me sort of out of the blue at a professional conference and introduced himself and said what he did. And he probably came up with the idea of doing this course. And I think, wow, that's interesting. And for me, it's interesting because, well, for several reasons. I mean, for a long time now, I've talked and written about problems with the New Testament. And it's been very interesting. Javad, I don't think I told you this, but I've had two groups of people, especially, who seem to really like my work and want to use it. And the groups are Muslims and Mormons. And I wish there were a third, because as a good evangelical, I like to have alliteration with three things. But the Methodists just, they don't go for it as much. Some do. It's okay. But Mormons and Muslims. And in both cases, when people who've talked to me about it from those communities, it's been because they see then the New Testament standing in contrast with their own scriptures. And so, Mormons say, yeah, well, there may be problems with the New Testament, but the Book of Mormon, man, that is, there you go. And, and Muslims will say, well, yeah, you got all these, these scribes are changing everything in the New Testament, but not the Quran. We know exactly what it was originally said. There are no errors in it. And, you need to convert. The problem, you gave up on Christianity. You need to come to Islam, man. And so I thought, wow, it'd be really interesting to have the two of us. We're not going to have, of course, we're not going to have exactly the same problems. We're not going to have the same extent of problems, but to have someone talk about the historical issues with the Quran on the same topics that I'm talking about, historical issues with the New Testament, I just think that's going to be exceedingly interesting.
In Urdu, we have this saying, I'll translate it. It sounds funny in English, but it's basically saying that you're cutting your own feet with the axe. And basically what I'm trying to say is, when it comes to Muslims, I think Bart nailed it, that it's Muslims taking what Bart's saying about the Bible and saying, haha, look at their Bible, look how bad it is, and look how great our Quran is. But that has like two negative effects, I think, that Muslims don't really think about. And that's where I'm saying they're cutting their own feet. Is number one is, I actually think the Quran, from a critical standpoint, if you read it, most critical scholars seem to think that the Quran doesn't really say that the previous scriptures are corrupted. I think on my reading, it's actually saying that they are good to follow, that you should follow them. There's verses that explicitly say to Jews and Christians that they should follow their Torah and the gospel. So if you're attacking the Torah and the gospel and the Quran is saying to follow them, that's something to think about there. And then number two is, actually in this comparison, this polemical way, Muslims have changed their own theology almost by saying that, by hyper exaggerating the difference between the Quran and the Bible, so that you grew up with this. I grew up with this idea that no two Qurans anywhere in the world differ even letter and dot. And I do think that's a very modern argument. And that came about, I think, in polemical discussions with Christians, where they were reading this critical scholarship when it came to the Bible, and then they wanted to make a comparison to the Quran. And in that process, they kind of exaggerated the claims about the Quran.
No, Derek, I was just going to say, during this course, one of the fun things is going to be that, I'll give a lecture on the New Testament topic. He'll do the Quran topic, and then we're going to talk to each other about it. And so, like, when he says something like that, man, I want to dig in and find out more. And so we're going to have a chance to do that. Plus a Q&A. People are going to be able to ask questions too. So, yeah. Okay. Sorry. I just wanted to throw it in.
This is perfect. That means
dialogue as well.
That means sign up, everybody. You got to sign up for this. So, Javad, it's like saying, are there scientific miracles in the Quran, right? This is a recent development, a post-enlightenment kind of thing, I think, where we're forced or feeling coerced by society and the ideas we have to like put these like rules and structures that were never there by these original authors. And so that leads me to the highlight, I guess, of your course, which is the historical problems. And I say problems with a double-edged sword, as you pointed out with the axe cutting the feet, is that while it's a problem, or we can point out problems or the mundane facts that we might find from historical method, it also might be a solution. So I guess what I'm saying is many people will go to the New Testament, find flaws, but sometimes that historical critical method can get you back to maybe what Jesus did. And I'll give you an example on that, looking at the New Testament to get you to maybe comment briefly on this, is that when I look at the historical Jesus, based on the best research I can pick up from the academics, you have a Jewish guy, sure, he's apocalyptic. Let's put that to the side for a second. He's standing up for the poor. He's trying to do what I would say is a socially good thing for the people in the class I think he comes from. And that are people who are less fortunate. They don't have the best. They're in a struggle. They're in a bad predicament in the world. The meek shall inherit the earth. The first shall be last. These kind of philosophical ideas that you're finding floating around in Stoicism and other things. But here's this guy who kind of stands for the weak, stands for the poor, wants to help the widow, wants to, that kind of idea. And he becomes, of course, God over time. But can we find something with Muhammad? Because I hear a lot of people who are anti-Islam go, just a pure warlord. There's nothing good there. I engaged recently doing a video against David Wood because everything he said about Islam applied to Christianity. And I was like, what are you doing, man? So sorry for the rant. I just feel it's necessary that we have these conversations.
Great question. I'm answering first on all of these. Should Bart, do you want to say anything? Or
No, go for it.
Okay. Yeah. So I agree with you that, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do the course, is that I think there's a lot of public interest in Islamic origins, but it's because academics aren't really giving introductory material and putting it out there. The discourse is dominated by apologists on the one side and then polemicists on the other, and they both kind of weaponize the material and stretch it to fit their own agenda. So I was like, hey, why don't we do a broad survey introductory course that you teach at Harvard or Notre Dame or wherever and give it to the public? So that's just based on your last comment that I was saying. Now, as far as what you asked, I think it's absolutely true that, well, number one is I would say that in some sense, the historical critical approach can be a pious endeavor for whether it's liberal Christians or liberal Muslims, because they're trying to get back to what the historical Jesus or what the historical Muhammad actually said or did. So as a Muslim, I want to know that. And I want to know that beyond what the tradition claims, because the tradition can attribute all sorts of things. So that's why I think it's actually a pious act in that sense. And number two is sometimes it can contradict, or often does, later orthodoxy, which has a tendency to, in the construction of orthodoxy, you have to argue who's in and who's out, which can lead to some intolerance. And so when you're working backward to get beyond that, that can sometimes highlight certain positive aspects against the tradition. So on this issue of like warfare, my dissertation is basically trying to show that it's the later exegetes who were, living under empire who weaponized or militarized the Quranic text. And so I'm trying to undo some of that and say, look at that process. So I think that's a benefit of historical critical scholarship.
Bart Ehrman's book.
Yeah,
I think, right?
I think I think that's going to be really interesting because it's stuff that most of us don't know. And so I think that's really good. I mean, when you get to the New Testament, it's very hard to convince conservative Christians, whether they're evangelical or Catholic or whatever, that seeing discrepancies in the accounts, say, of the life of Jesus, or discrepancies between what Paul says about himself and what the book of Acts says about him, or seeing this kind of range of like these discrepancies and contradictions, it seems like a threat to most people, which I understand because it did to me as well at one point in my life. But the point that Javad was just making is a very important one, which is that if you recognize diversity and variety at kind of the early stages of these religions, it in most cases, it leads to greater tolerance because you recognize that it wasn't always like a single thing. And if you don't subscribe to this single thing, then you're out, you're off limits and you're out of bounds. And it's not like that, because in the New Testament, if you can show that Matthew has a very different understanding of the Jewish law, say, than Paul. Or if you can show that Mark has a different view of why Jesus died than Luke. Among other things, it shows variety, but it also allows you to let each author say what he wants to say and not pretend that he's saying something that some other author is saying. And so when you do that, then you actually understand him better. And so this is a way to understand things better. It's not a way to destroy the book or to destroy, it's actually looking for the truth about these things. And what you do with it religiously is, as Javad was saying, people always tell me I'm trying to destroy people's faith, and it's just not true, because if you see these things about the Bible, you understand it better. And so if you're a Christian, surely you want to understand the Bible better. And so, so I'm a big fan of historical criticism, and seeing it applied to the Quran is going to be very enlightening for many of us, but also kind of hopeful for many of us.
I've been found guilty, I confess, on comparing or trying to use kind of a heuristic approach on the scholarship of what we find on New Testament when I'm looking at Islamic stuff. And it isn't typically Muslims who have this problem, even though I'm sure if they watch, they may. But I get attacked by the Christian apologists online, and they always get angry because I draw back to Christianity to use an example of scholarship I've learned. Thank you, Bart. You got me in trouble. But seriously, it's important to highlight this, and I want Javad to maybe tune into this, because I've been doing that. Is that a false dilemma? Is there not something comparable in what's going on? I know that there aren't gospels. There's a Quran, but the tradition is very messy. How we get the Quran exactly, there's variations on that in the tradition of exactly, who and when and what text or what words may be in it and things like that. So I'm kind of asking you, Javad, like, while the endeavor is not how Matthew used Mark and how Luke may rewrite Mark, or John might know all three, or in redactional layers and stuff in the same identical way, what is comparable that you've noticed on New Testament scholarship to the Quran without giving away too much of the course?
That's a great question. So modern Islamic studies began with Bible scholars who basically used the same tools and started applying them to the Quran and the life story of the Prophet Muhammad. Often we place, like, Abraham Geiger. He had a book that was called "What Did Muhammad Borrow from Judaism?" It's translated that from the German, but that's really the first book, one of the first books that's considered the impetus for modern Islamic studies. So to counter this, some Islamic traditionalists will say that this is problematic, that you're just assuming that the techniques and methods of biblical studies will apply to the Quran when the Quran has a different history and cultural context, etc. I take a middle ground approach, which is, I think a lot of it does definitely apply. And that's precisely why I think a course like this is so important, because when you study the Quran, you should definitely do it in a comparative way, especially since biblical studies is so much more advanced. It's just had so much more time and scholarship behind it. So we in Islamic studies and Quranic studies can really benefit from the knowledge that Bart Ehrman and other Bible scholars are bringing. But with that in mind, I would make the caveat that we do need to recognize that it is a different text. There are some differences. So you can't just translate everything one to one, but you have to kind of learn from what biblical studies did and see how does it apply and to what degree does it apply to the Quran and the quest for the historical Muhammad. So a lot does translate, but it's not just one-to-one. So there's some work that you have to do to get to it. So that's the kind of approach that I would take.
Bart, did you want to add anything to that, or do you want me to carry on?
No, I think he's absolutely right. It's not going to be like these strict things, kind of strict. You can't put them in columns, so they got to go across the columns like that. I would say, in addition to that, that history is history, and people who are historians have pretty well set, views about how you establish what happened in the past. And so, to kind of in broad terms, that's why you could apply historical criticism to various fields, not expecting the same results, but you don't, you basically, historians look for similar things when they're trying to establish, and it doesn't matter what you're doing. I mean, if you're studying Charlemagne or something, or you're studying, Thomas Jefferson, or you're studying Julius Caesar, you've got sources, and you've got to figure out how the sources are valuable, where they have mistake, how reliable they can be when you can check them, whether they contradict each other, whether they're internally coherent, whether there are things you do, right, as a historian. And I think the striking thing for a seminar like this is to see how it can be done across two very different sets of scripture, not to get the same results, but to compare the two, but doing serious history on both is because, for many centuries, it was never done on the Bible until the Enlightenment, and until fairly recent times, so far as I know, it wasn't really done much on the Quran either. And so now we're kind of breaking into this era where we can do both.
I agree with Bart completely that, we have to approach this just as you approach any other text. You can approach the Quran in the same way. One of the kind of counters that the conservative Islamic traditionalists give is that they kind of want to bag this all in with, use the word Orientalism and say that this is using Western presuppositions and epistemology, and it just doesn't apply when you translate it across a culture, etc. But, when I read like Christian fundamentalists, when they are responding to historical critical scholarship, I find that they use some of the same exact counter arguments against critical Western scholars. For example, one of the things that we use about that Bart mentioned was that people are people anywhere. And that's one of the, it's the principle of analogy, that whether it's in the time of the Prophet Muhammad and the companions after him, they act in a certain ways. That's kind of a presupposition that you can rely on. And I think that applies to Islam or Christianity. But you'll see Bible fundamentalists arguing against that kind of thing as well. So what I'm trying to say is that the arguments that are used against the historical critical method are not really specific to Muslims. They're kind of used by these are tough bullets to swallow for people of faith when you grew up with these kind of orthodox beliefs, is what I would say.
I think most American Christians assume that the Bible was produced in California. It too's not a Western document. I mean, but they treat, it's like it has all the assumptions I had growing up, that kind of thing. Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah. I really appreciate this perception, and hopefully encouraging more believers to, I guess, get to the facts. Maybe what does the historical critical method help us understand what may have really happened, and possibly separating legend from, or myth from, reality in the sense of what actually happened. But also with the caveat of saying, just because it's legend and myth doesn't mean it doesn't have value. I was listening to the audiobook by Leslie Hazelton, The First Muslim. And I have to say this as a Westerner who really is born and raised in a military household where my dad went over to the Middle East during 9/11 and has all the reasons and bias to be just anti-Islam, right, in the West, as you know. And I listened to it, and I had kind of like a deep respect and interest in curiosity about this character, this person we call Muhammad, and he's a prophet in this religion we call Islam, and understanding its roots and things like that from almost like a storytelling way that I was interested. And as you know, not a believer, but I could appreciate it. And I was like, okay, hold on. What if more people understood this? Wouldn't this create less bias, less judgment of other people, and at least empathizing with each other? And I'm hoping, my heart in the whole course that you're doing is that this creates more unity and finds a way to give people more respect, even if we disagree at the end of the day over whatever conclusions ontologically we draw from these religions.
I agree.
We're on board.
Amen.
My goal is to bring people to the middle, I would say. And so for Muslims who are on a more fundamentalist side, I want to bring them into the middle and realize that the things that they're attacking, like the Bible for and Christianity for, well, maybe we should take a look at our own scriptures and sources and say, okay, we have some similar issues to deal with. And I think that will kind of push them more to the middle. And then people on the other side, kind of on the polemical side or the anti-Islam side, I want to show them that, it's not, like you said, even if you take it as myth and legend and all this, that there is something meaningful going on. You may not agree with it, you may have your differences, but it's not all just, hoo-ha garbage kind of thing. There is something deep and meaningful to it. Like, you can appreciate the Bible. You don't have to be someone of faith to appreciate the Bible from a literature standpoint. So the same way, I think you could take that position when it comes to the Quran.
This course, last word, guys, why should people sign up?
Why shouldn't they sign up? Are you kidding me? When you said you've never heard of something like this in the public sphere before, I mean, maybe Javad has. I haven't heard anything like this in the private sphere. I mean, this is like, I've never heard of something like this before. And it's just like, it's amazing that, it hasn't been done. And so I'm really looking forward to this. And I think this is going to be one of those things that people are going they're just going to learn a ton. With people who are really knowledgeable about the Quran are going to learn all sorts of things that they probably don't know. And people are interested in the New Testament. They don't learn anything new from me. They're going to learn it from Javad, and this is going to be, I think, a really, really interesting and important.
Thank you. Any final words from you, Javad?
No, I'm just gonna reiterate or agree with Bart on that. I think this is one of a kind course, and putting the Bible and the Quran in conversation, and to have the honor of doing it with Sheikh Bart Ehrman. I mean, this is huge. So this is I'm really excited about this.
Well, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard the guys. Sign up right now. The link is in the description. You see it on the screen, and I hope to see you there.